Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the League of Nations. And here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. At the beginning of this unit, you learned the term foreign policy, which is a government strategy in dealing with other countries. So far, we've seen some different examples of US foreign policy, like imperialism, where the government takes over other countries, neutrality, where the government promises not to take sides in a war, and war, where the government sends soldiers into battle. When World War I started, President Woodrow Wilson pledged neutrality, but after the sinking of the Lusitania and the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, he changed his mind and America joined the war. We're going to end this unit by looking at two other examples of foreign policy: diplomacy and isolation. I'll tell you what those mean in a moment. World War I was the worst war the world had ever seen up to that point. Millions of people died, often in gruesome and senseless ways. And to many people, the war didn't seem to have accomplished anything. The killing seemed pointless. And so in response, people started to ask how a similar war could be prevented so that it never happened again. And one answer to that question came from US President Woodrow Wilson. In 1918, Wilson proposed a plan that he called the 14 Points. The 14 Points were 14 ideas for spreading peace and democracy around the world. I'm not going to go into all 14 points, but some important ones included an end to secret alliances, a reduction in weapons production, and free navigation of the seas by ships without the threat of submarine attacks. Today, we're going to focus on the last of the 14 points, point number 14. And the 14th point called for the creation of what Wilson called the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international organization that would promote world peace through diplomacy. Diplomacy means talking out problems. In the League of Nations, every country in the world would have a representative. And those representatives would all meet regularly in a big hall like the one in this picture. And the idea was, if two countries had a conflict, they would solve it by having their representatives talk it out. In other words, they would use diplomacy instead of using war. Most countries in the world agreed to this idea, and in 1920, the League of Nations was formed. It lasted until 1945, when it was replaced by a new organization called the United Nations. Although most countries in the world joined the League of Nations, one very important country did not, and that country was the United States. And that's because the majority of Congress supported a different foreign policy called isolation. Isolation is a policy of non-involvement in other countries' affairs. It means that one country isolates itself and tries to interact with other countries as little as possible. In America, isolation is sometimes called America First. The idea there is America should focus on itself and not worry about what's happening in other parts of the world. Isolation is the opposite of what President Wilson proposed for the League of Nations, because joining the League of Nations would have required the US to be involved with other countries in an effort to create peace. So even though Wilson supported the League of Nations, Congress did not, and in the end, Congress rejected US involvement in the League in favor of a policy of isolation. This is a good example of checks and balances in US government. The president, or the executive branch, wanted one thing, but Congress, the legislative branch, overruled him. Irony is what happens when what actually happens is the opposite of what you would expect to happen. So I could say that it's ironic that the US didn't join the League of Nations because it was the president of the US who proposed the idea in the first place. Wilson supported the League, but he could not get Congress to approve it. In class, you'll look at some arguments that Americans made for and against joining the League of Nations. In the meantime, think about what your own opinion is. If you were an American living in 1918, would you have supported international diplomacy and the League of Nations? Or would you have supported isolation? Why? And now it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. I will see you in class. Bye, students.